I joined the military because I wanted respect, not adventure. Growing up, our house was loud with arguments and quiet with love. I learned early that promises were weak and silence won fights. I told myself service would make me valuable. I told myself a uniform would fix what family never did. When the enlistment papers came, I signed them without shaking. I believed leaving was the same as rising. My father, Richard, watched me pack and said, "You're doing the right thing." I waited for more. He cleared his throat instead. Linda smiled too fast and said, "We'll take care of everything here." Her hand rested on my arm like a promise. I asked, "The house, the land, my savings?" She nodded. "Family protects family." Ethan laughed from the couch and said, "Don't worry, hero." I said, "I earned that money." Linda replied, "And we'll guard it." My father stared at the floor. I tried to joke. "Just don't sell my bed." Ethan snorted. "Relax." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe any of them. I folded my last shirt and felt like I was folding myself smaller. That night, I sat at the table with my enlistment letter. Linda said, "You'll come back a man." I asked, "Wasn't I one already?" She laughed softly. My father said nothing. The silence answered me. I signed a power of attorney because Linda said it was smart. She said, "Trust me." I did. In the morning, Ethan borrowed my car. "Just for a spin," he said. I handed him the keys. Linda hugged me tight. "We'll keep everything safe." My father finally said, "I'm proud of you." I held on to those words like they could float me across oceans. I told myself I was leaving something solid behind. At the door, my father avoided my eyes. Linda whispered, "We'll handle the bills." I said, "Please don't mess this up." She smiled. "We won't." Ethan waved and said, "Go be a soldier." I nodded and stepped outside. The house looked smaller already. As I drove away, I called my best friend and said, "I'm finally doing something right." He laughed and said, "Don't forget who you are." I promised I wouldn't. I believed sacrifice would be rewarded. I believed distance would fix us. I believed love waited for me at the end of duty. I listed everything I owned out loud to calm myself. The house is paid for. The land is mine. The savings are untouched. Linda had said yes to all of it. My father had nodded. Ethan had laughed. I told myself agreements were real if spoken. I told myself family was a contract. At the station, Linda said, "Call us every week." I said, "I will." My father hugged me, stiff and brief. "Be safe," he said. Ethan whispered, "Don't die." I forced a smile. I wanted their fear to mean love. I wanted their words to mean truth. On the bus, I watched my reflection shake with motion. I said, "This is for us." No one answered. I remembered Linda's smile and my father's silence. I remembered Ethan's laugh. I told myself trust was strength. I told myself I was brave. Before the engine started, I texted Linda, "Please protect what I built." She replied, "Always." I texted my father, "Don't let me down." He sent a thumbs up. I stared at it and felt cold. I didn't know that silence could steal. I closed my eyes and made one last promise to myself. I'll come back better. I believed service would give me a future. I believed my family would keep my past safe. I believed love meant protection. I carried those beliefs with me into uniform. At training, I repeated their voices like prayers. "We've got this. Trust us. Family protects family." The words kept me standing when drills hurt. I didn't know faith could be used against me. I didn't know trust could be emptied without noise. On my first night away, I called home. Linda said, "Everything's fine." I asked, "The bills?" She said, "Handled." I asked for my father. He said, "Get some rest." Ethan shouted, "Don't worry." I hung up smiling. I pressed my phone to my chest and whispered, "I trust you." The word felt heavy but hopeful. I thought loyalty moved both ways. I thought distance made hearts careful. I didn't know I was handing my life over. When the lights went out, I pictured the front door closing behind me. I pictured Linda locking it. I pictured my father standing still. I pictured Ethan sitting down. I told myself sacrifice was safe. I told myself the future was waiting. I didn't know the cost. I believed I was trading comfort for honor. I believed my family would guard what I built. I believed coming back would feel like home. I didn't know I was walking away from everything. I stepped forward, carrying hope, trust, and promises, unaware they were already slipping through my hands forever. I thought I was safe. I was wrong. I learned much later. Training stripped me down fast. The sergeant yelled, "Again?" and I answered, "Yes, sir." My muscles burned, my throat stayed dry, and sleep felt like a rumor. I told myself, this is respect. At night I whispered, don't quit. The guy on the bunk above me laughed and said, you won't. His name was Marcus. He said, stick with me. I did. Marcus talked when others slept. Why'd you join? He asked. I said, family. He snorted. I joined to disappear. We shook hands like that meant something. On runs he counted my steps. Breathe, he said. I breathed. When I stumbled he said, I've got you. I believed him. Calls home were short. Linda said, busy day. I asked, everything okay? She said, of course. My father said, focus on training. Ethan shouted, be careful, then laughed. I asked, the house. Linda replied, later. The line went dead. Marcus watched my face. They dodging you? I said, no. He raised an eyebrow. I changed the subject. The desert taught me silence. Wind screamed, guns cracked, and nights froze. Marcus said, letters help. I wrote. I'm safe, I said. Take care of my place. Weeks passed. Replies came thinner. Linda wrote, proud of you. No details. My father wrote, stay strong. Nothing else. I asked again. Is my land okay? The answer never came. On patrol, Marcus joked, when this ends, burgers on me. I said, I'll buy. He grinned. Deal. The radio hissed. Our leader said, move. I felt sand in my teeth. A blast threw me sideways. Noise swallowed everything. I hit hard. My ears rang. I tasted metal. Someone screamed my name. I saw smoke and blood. Marcus lay still. I crawled and said, talk to me. He didn't. A medic shouted, pressure. Hands pressed my leg. Pain flashed white. I yelled, Marcus. The medic said, focus on me. I said, he promised burgers. The medic didn't answer. I woke later with bandages and quiet. A chaplain said, I'm sorry. I asked, Marcus? He shook his head. I stared at the ceiling and said, okay. My voice broke. I whispered, okay. Life felt thin like paper. I realized I could vanish without warning. I realized promises could end mid-sentence. I called home from a hospital tent. Linda didn't pick up. I tried again. Voicemail. I texted, I'm hurt. No reply. I texted, I'm alive. Nothing. I texted my father, please call. Hours passed. A nurse said, rest. I said, I can't. When Linda finally answered, she said, you scared us. I said, I was blown up. She said, you're okay now. I asked, the house. She sighed. Why now? I said, because I almost died. She said, we'll talk later. Click. Anger rose slow and heavy. I told myself, they're stressed. I told myself, be patient. I held Marcus's tag they gave me to pass along. I didn't know who to give it to. I held my own tags and felt cold. I said, I'm still here. No one answered. Back on duty, I moved careful. Marcus's bunk stayed empty. I talked to it anyway. I'll keep going, I said. Night stretched. I wrote again. Please confirm my property is safe. No response. Silence felt louder than gunfire. One evening, a soldier asked, who you call first when this ends? I said, my family. The word tasted strange. I looked at my tags and said, I'm coming home. I promised myself out loud, I'll rebuild. The desert listened. My phone stayed quiet. I stood on my street and said, I'm home. The words felt wrong. A strange car sat in my driveway. I walked to the door and knocked. A woman I didn't know opened it and said, can I help you? I said, this is my house. She frowned and replied, we rent here. My chest tightened. I asked, from who? She said, Linda? I stepped back and called Linda. Why are strangers in my house? She said, lower your voice. I said, answer me. She replied, it was for the family. I asked, my family or yours? She said, don't be dramatic. I felt the ground tilt. My father came outside. I said, Dad, tell me this isn't real. He looked at the grass and said, we did what we had to. I asked, you sold my house? He whispered, it was complicated. I laughed once, sharp and ugly. While I was gone? He didn't answer. Ethan pulled up in a truck that used to exist only in my dreams. He stepped out wearing my jacket. He grinned and said, nice to see you, soldier. I said, Take that off. He laughed. Relax. I asked, did you buy that with my money? He shrugged. Family money. I turned to Linda. You said you'd protect it. She crossed her arms. I did. I said, you stole it. She said, watch your mouth. My father said, please? I asked, where's my land? Linda said, transferred. I said, without my consent? She replied, you signed. I felt sick. I trusted you. She said, you left. Ethan said, don't blame us because you ran off. I stepped toward him. I didn't run. My father stood between us and said, stop. I asked him, did you know? He whispered, I was scared. I walked away before I broke something. I sat on the curb and called a lawyer whose name I found online. He said, this is Mr. Collins. I said, my family took my property while I was deployed. He paused. Did you give power of attorney? I said, yes. He said, that doesn't mean they can do this. I asked, is it illegal? He said, it might be. That word hit me harder than any blast. Might be. I thanked him and hung up. I stared at the house that wasn't mine. The renters watched from the window like I was a stranger. I went back to Linda. A lawyer says this isn't right. She laughed. Lawyers say lots of things. I said, I'll fight you. She smiled cold and said, with what? My father finally looked up. His eyes were wet. I'm sorry. I asked, for what? He had no answer. Ethan leaned on the truck. You should move on. I said, give me my keys. He tossed them. They don't fit anymore. I caught them and felt nothing. Linda said, you can stay a few nights. I said, no, my voice shook. I won't beg. Night fell. I sat in my car with my bags. I texted Marcus's number and remembered he was gone. I laughed then cried. I reclined the seat and said, this is temporary. The words sounded fake. I looked at the house one last time. I whispered, was I ever really part of this family? No one answered. I walked into the county office and said, I need records. The clerk asked, name? I said mine. She typed and frowned. These transfers happened fast. I asked, by who? She said, power of attorney. My stomach dropped. I said, that wasn't permission. She replied, it was used that way. I left and called Ethan. Did you know? He laughed and said, why dig? I said, answer me. He paused then said, Mom handled it. I said, you knew. He sighed. It benefited us. I hung up shaking. I met my father at a diner. I said, tell me the truth. He stirred coffee and said, Linda pushed. I asked, did you stop her? He whispered, I couldn't. I leaned forward. You wouldn't. He flinched. I was scared. I said, of her? He nodded. I said, I trusted you. He said, I know. I said, you watched them take everything. He said, I thought it would calm things. I laughed bitterly. It erased me. He reached out. I pulled back. Don't. I slammed my hand on the table. Say it. He whispered, I failed you. That hurt more than theft. I stood. I won't beg. He cried. I left. Outside I ran into Sarah. She said, is that you? I said, yeah. She hugged me and asked, you okay? I said, no. She said, coffee? I nodded. At the bank she said, I can look quietly. I said, please? She scanned files and said, these signatures don't match. I asked, forged? She said, looks like it. My chest burned. I said, Ethan? She said, he withdrew funds. I whispered, they planned this. Sarah said, we'll document everything. I said, no noise. She nodded. Smart. That night I called Linda. You forged my name. She snapped, prove it? I said, I will. She laughed. You have nothing. I said, I have time. I sat alone and argued with myself. Walk away. Fight. Forgive. Never. I looked at my hands and said, I won't beg anymore. I texted Sarah, proceed. She replied, already started. I slept poorly and woke determined. If I fight, I said, I fight smart. The landlord said, it's small. I said, I don't need big. He asked, cash? I nodded. He handed me a key and said, no trouble. I said, I keep to myself. The room had one bed, one window, and silence. I dropped my bag and said, This works. On my first night, I sat on the bed and said out loud, "You're not homeless." The word still scared me. I called Sarah and said, "I found a place." She replied, "I'm proud of you." I didn't know why that mattered, but it did. I found security work fast. The manager asked, "Experience?" I said, "Military." He said, "You start tonight." I nodded. The uniform felt lighter than the last one, but my back stayed straight. A guard asked, "You knew?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Rules?" I said, "Stay alert." He smiled. During breaks, I counted money and said, "Slow and steady." I skipped meals and said, "Temporary." I wrote numbers in a notebook. Rent first. Save next. No extras. I heard Marcus's voice in my head. Discipline wins. I answered, "I know." One night my phone buzzed. A message read, "You good?" I stared, then typed, "I'm standing." Another buzz followed. "That's who you are." I smiled and whispered, "Thanks, man." I didn't ask how he checked in. I just accepted it. Sarah met me for coffee. She said, "Talk." I said, "I'm tired." She said, "I'm listening." I told her about work in the room. She nodded and said, "You're rebuilding." I shrugged. "Brick by brick." She said, "You don't sound angry." I said, "I am." She said, "You're not reckless." I said, "Not anymore." She slid a folder across the table. Quiet updates. I asked, "Bad?" She said, "For them." I asked, "Ethan?" She said, "Overdrafts. Missed payments." I nodded. "Linda?" She sighed. "Spending didn't slow." I said, "I won't touch it." She said, "Smart." At work, a supervisor asked, "Why so calm?" I said, "Practice." He laughed. "Keep it." I kept it. Nights passed. My body learned the route. My mind learned patience. I stopped checking my phone every hour. Silence felt lighter now. I heard rumors without asking. Property falling apart. Tenants unhappy. Truck payments late. I said nothing. I told myself, not your mess. The urge to call rose and fell. I let it fall. One evening, Sarah said, "You okay with this pace?" I said, "I need it." She said, "You don't need revenge." I said, "I need balance." She smiled. "That's healthier." Back in my room, I did push-ups and said, "Control." I cleaned and said, "Order." I slept and said, "Tomorrow?" I didn't dream of shouting. I dreamed of space. My phone buzzed at dawn. Unknown number. I answered. "This is Mr. Collins," the voice said. I stood. "Yes." He said, "You have a strong case." I closed my eyes and said, "Good." My phone buzzed early. Unknown number. I answered. "Ethan?" he said. I stayed silent. "Hey, I need your advice." I asked, "About what?" He said, "The house, taxes." I messed up. I didn't respond. He added, "Can you help?" I said nothing and hung up. Sarah called later. "You ignored him?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." I asked, "Why?" She replied, "He doesn't deserve it." I whispered, "I know." Later a knock. My father stood outside, shoulders hunched. "I need you," he said, eyes red. I said, "About what?" He said, "Everything. Linda, Ethan, the house." I asked, "You want me to fix it?" He nodded. I said, "No," he stuttered. "Please, you're the only one." I said, "I'm not that man anymore." He cried. I didn't move. I said, "I won't beg for their love. Not again." He whispered, "I was weak." I said, "Yes, you were." That night I checked my messages. Ethan texted, "Call me. It's urgent." I deleted it. Sarah said, "Ignore. Let it fall." I asked, "It's hard." She said, "It will be." I said, "I'm ready." News came in small bursts. Linda faced tax issues. Fraud claims. Debt collectors. I said nothing. Marcus would have laughed. I smiled faintly alone. "Patience," I whispered. Ethan tried again. "I didn't know. Can you help?" I replied, "You caused it." No answer came. Good. Sarah visited. "The documents?" I asked. She said, "Verified. They're crumbling." I said, "Finally." She added, "It'll hurt though, seeing them fail." I nodded. "I'm okay." My father called at night. I wish you'd help." I said no. "You need to face this too." He sobbed. I said, We all face our choices. Some harder than others. For once, silence felt calm. I cooked my own dinner. I cleaned my room. I checked my savings. No panic. No rage. Just space. Sarah said, "This is the first step to real peace." I said, "Feels like it." Ethan's calls slowed. Linda's threats faltered. Letters piled up and signed unpaid. I watched without reaching. Power shifts quietly, I told myself. I called Sarah. "It's working." She said, "Yes." Slowly. I said, "I've waited long enough." That night I laid in my bed. No fear. No anger. Just calm. I said, "I am free." I drifted to sleep. Peace was heavy but real. I felt it settle. Karma wasn't loud. It was patient. And finally it was mine. I heard the news first from a neighbor. Ethan's house, foreclosure. I said nothing, just listened. The neighbor added, "He's losing friends too. Nobody shows up." I nodded, though they couldn't see me. Later, Ethan showed up at the cafe where I met Sarah. He slammed his hand on the table. "You did this," he yelled. I leaned back. "Did what?" He shouted, "You ruined me. Everything, gone." I said calmly, "Ethan, you did this." He shook his head. "No, Mom, Dad, you helped me. I was supposed to have everything." I said, "You had everything and you threw it away." He spat, "You think you're better?" I said, "I survived. You didn't." "That's the difference." People stared. Some whispered. He leaned closer. "You're gloating." I said, "I'm stating facts." He shouted, "I could destroy you." I said, "You already tried." Linda appeared behind him. "It's your fault," she screamed. I looked at her. "No. You enabled it. You spent, forged, ignored." She shouted, "Don't blame me." I said, "Blame is for those who can accept it." Ethan pointed at me. "I trusted you." I said, "You trusted no one but yourself." He stared, confused, angry. I continued, "I didn't touch your money. I didn't move your things. You ruined it all." He ran a hand through his hair. "Mom said," I interrupted, "Mom spent it." She lied. "You knew." His jaw tightened. I said, "Look at the house. The truck. The debts. You created this." A waitress said quietly, "Wow." Ethan turned furious. I said, "People are listening. Truth doesn't need permission." He stepped back. "I'll fix it," he said. I said, "You can't." His friends, the ones who used to laugh at me, stopped coming to his table. One muttered, "Guess he's on his own." Linda collapsed in a chair. "I can't believe this." I said, "Believe it? This is reality." She whispered, "I never thought." I said, "You never thought because you never cared." My father appeared at the door, trembling. I didn't know it would get this bad," he said. I said, "You did. You chose fear over truth." He sank to the floor. I didn't move closer. I said, "I warned you." Ethan glared at me. "You're enjoying this." I said, "I'm observing it." "You made your choices." He shouted, "I'll ruin you." I laughed softly. "You're out of tools, Ethan. All that's left is consequences." Linda whispered, "It's all your fault." I said, "No. Yours, and yours. No one else." She covered her face. Ethan turned and stomped out. I watched him go. "Goodbye, Ethan," I whispered. My father looked up. I failed you," he said. I said, "Yes, you did." The cafe returned to calm. I sipped my coffee and said quietly, "Karma doesn't ask permission." I felt no glee. Only relief. Only quiet closure. The call came first. "Settlement reached," said Mr. Collins. I asked, "Partial or full?" He replied, "Partial. Enough to rebuild, enough to move on." I leaned back in my chair. "Good," I said quietly. I called Linda. No answer. I called Ethan. No answer. I texted both. Nothing. I said aloud, "Fine. I don't need you." My father appeared at my door. I'm sorry," he said, eyes red. I looked at him and said, "Again?" He nodded. I said, "I forgive you." He swallowed hard. "Reconcile?" I shook my head. "No. I can forgive without forgetting." I sold the house and land. A realtor asked, "Do you really want to sell?" I said, "Yes. Memories aren't for living." He nodded. "Understood." I handed over the keys and said, "Goodbye." Sarah called that night. "Big day." I said, "It's done." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Free. Empty but free. She said, "That's healthy." I smiled. "Thanks for standing quietly." Ethan called days later. "I want to talk." I said, "I don't." He pleaded. I said, "You lost your chance." Click. Silence felt clean. I walked past the old house one last time. The new owners waved. I waved back. No pain, no regret, only distance. I whispered, "It's not mine anymore." My father called again. "I hope you find peace." I said, "I will. Don't expect me to step back in." He said, "I understand." I met Sarah for coffee. "You okay?" she asked. I said, "Better. Choices made. Mistakes faced." She said, "No revenge?" I said, "Revenge is quiet." I chose peace. We talked about work plans, small things. No promises. No big declarations. Just honesty. Step by step, I said. She nodded. I thought about Linda. Gone. No trace. Ethan. Gone. No apology. I said, "Closure isn't them. It's me." I checked my bank. Partial assets restored, enough to start fresh. I said, "Finally." I felt light. Evenings were quiet. I cooked, read, slept. No bitterness. No waiting. Only calm. I called Sarah once more. "Thanks for everything." She smiled. "Always." I looked at the horizon from my balcony. I said, "I control my life. I control my heart." No one else mattered. No one else deserved access. Only me. Only my choices. I whispered to the night, "I am done." Peace settled. Finally. I stood in my small apartment and said aloud, "This is mine." No one interrupted. No one questioned it. I had rebuilt quietly, steadily, one choice at a time. I poured coffee and watched sunlight hit the floor. I whispered, "I earned this." I called Sarah. "Morning," she said. I said, "I feel different." She asked, "Better?" I said, "Calmer. Stronger." She laughed softly. "You sound lighter." I said, "I am." I remembered Marcus. I remembered the desert, the sand, the fire. I said, "I survived for more than duty. I survived for me." I walked to the memorial that afternoon. Names etched in stone. I touched the metal plate. "You didn't get to go home," I said softly. "I remember. I honor you." A tear ran down. I wiped it. Marcus, the others, all gone, but I carried them quietly. A man beside me said, "Thank you for your service." I nodded. "We all did what we could." He smiled, walked on. I whispered, "Some never got the chance." I thought of Linda. Gone. Ethan. Gone. My father. Forgiven but distant. I said, "I let go." No anger remained. Only lessons. Only clarity. I walked the streets I once owned, once lost. Every corner reminded me of betrayal, but I looked straight ahead. I said, "This is my path." At the office, a client asked, "How did you handle it all?" I said, "Patience, strategy, discipline." I smiled faintly. And survival. Survival isn't just living, it's reclaiming yourself. I met Sarah later for dinner. "You've changed," she said. I said, "I've grown." She smiled, "I can see it." I said, "Step by step. No rushing. No promises, just truth." She nodded. That night I held my dog tags. I whispered, "You reminded me of what matters. Strength, honor, integrity." I placed them on the shelf above my bed. "I carry you always." I walked through the old neighborhood. The house was no longer mine. I stopped at the gate, ran my hand along the fence. "This chapter is closed," I whispered. I didn't look back. In my apartment, I hung photos of my journey. Training, the desert, quiet nights of rebuilding. I said, "This is the man I became." I cooked my own meal, cleaned my space, organized my life. I said, "Everything here is mine, made by my hands, by my choices." I sat on the balcony as night fell. The city lights glimmered. I said, "Freedom isn't given. It's taken, built, earned." I texted Sarah, "I'm proud of how far I've come." She replied, "So am I." I smiled. I locked the door behind me the next morning. "Past stay there," I said. Keys clicked. I walked forward, feeling the weight of betrayal gone, replaced by calm, strength, and purpose. No regret followed me. No anger. Just me. My choices. My life. I breathed deeply and whispered, "I am free." The city stretched ahead, endless, waiting. I stepped forward without looking back. The man I became carried scars, lessons, and quiet victories. I said, This is my story now. And for the first time in years I smiled without doubt. I was home, finally, completely and entirely myself.